But I wanted to sum up by telling how I got here and how George and I came up with this particular topic and hope to accomplish the project that we've been engaging in. I first need to confess that although I'm not nearly as cantankerous or confrontational as David, I am a little bit of a hierarchical thinker in terms of the relationship of different kinds of consciousnesses. And I credit that to the Enlightenment legacy. I think one of the things that David's kind of gesturing towards is that there is a relatively recent set of values that are reflected in the personhood discourse that we've been using in this conference. And it's values that come out of the Enlightenment. It's values that include ideas of equality, but it also includes, and I think it was Samir who mentioned earlier, the idea that the kind of personhood that we've been talking about has a very unitary and atomistic content to it often. And that one of the reasons for that is the influence of kind of liberal individualist thought within the Enlightenment, the rational chooser, the rational citizen, the disconnected person. And I think we've heard some of the pushback against that, the necessary pushback that we live in a context of communities, that we're the product of communities, that ourselves are not the product of spontaneous generation out of our heads, but that we're the product of being grown up interdependent. But at any rate, we do live with this legacy of liberal individualist thought that came out of the Enlightenment. And the rights discourses, as Steve pointed to excellently this morning, the rights discourses that come out of that about how citizens should relate to one another egalitarianly and building contracts and so forth. That is the logic of the kind of non-anthropocentric personhood ethics that we've been trying to build. And in particular, we've mentioned several times Locke and credited Locke. For us in the futurist / bioethics community, as you heard some with Linda's talk, we are concerned with this question of personal identity, and of course Peter gestured to it as well on Friday night. We're concerned with this question of personal identity not only because we want to make the Enlightenment claim, the claim that we think can go back as far as Locke, that personal identity is, and certain kind of consciousness features can be the basis of moral standing in the society, but also because we think that the technologies that are going to be coming in the future, neurotechnologies in particular, but also biological modifications and so forth, will be challenging the idea of personal identity. I happen to be a Buddhist. One of the core Buddhist ideas is that personal identity is an illusion, which Linda gestured to. I'm not the same person I was yesterday. If we were to put things in my head that would change my brain, I wouldn't be the same person tomorrow, but that's not necessarily a challenge to my personal identity. So one of the interests that I have had in this issue is that on the one hand, I want to see us make this transition to personhood as the basis of moral standing, psychological personhood as the basis of moral standing, and I see it as very central to the ongoing fight to win the goals of the Enlightenment. But at the same time, I'm looking forward and seeing that a lot of the things that are happening, a lot of the kinds of technological trends in particular, may threaten our ability to have any confidence in personal identity or personhood as the basis for this project. Another one of the ways in which it's challenged, we heard also in this conference, is that there may be many different kinds of psychologies. David was gesturing at the idea that there's kind of a convergence because most of the kinds of psychologies we've been looking at are mammalian and relatively recently separated from us. But if you get as far as the cephalopods, then something very different is going on. We still can't communicate that adequately with cetaceans. And if you then start thinking about artificial intelligence and all the different ways that the elements of consciousness may be separable, then it may be a very different picture in the future. And so at the same time that this idea, so that personal identity, as Locke said, consists in what we consider a person, which is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection, considers itself as itself, and is the same thinking thing in different times and places. That whole idea, idea of what personal identity could be and how personhood could be instantiated, as we've heard, and Lori's talk was excellent in kind of disaggregating the different elements of those things. all of those things may be combinatorially possible in the future, and we'll have to figure out what to do with that. Now, I wrote a book 10 years ago called Citizen Cyborg, and one of the things I proposed in there was that the ongoing fight for Enlightenment values was reflected in our contemporary politics, 20th century politics, which has this general structure to it. In many ways you could look at this, but economic politics and cultural politics, and the different spaces that people have fallen into in that terrain. But that the ongoing biopolitical battlefields that have emerged where Enlightenment values intersect with these biopolitical issues, debate over human enhancement, extending life and the control of the brain. And what I proposed in that book 10 years ago was that there was an emerging axis of politics, which I call biopolitics, and that there were bioconservatives and transhumanists at the other, and kind of bioliberals and all other kinds of things in between, that had the most extreme versions of pro and anti-Enlightenment views on these particular biopolitical topics. And what was so interesting was that 10 years ago, we were beginning to see the emergence of a biopolitics, which I would date back actually to Roe v. Wade, because Roe v. Wade was the first time in which mass politics around the question of personhood actually rubber met the road. You know, so the analogy that I give to people is if you go back to the French salons 200 years ago, the Enlightenment salons, you probably could have found French intellectuals around with some sherry saying, oh, wouldn't it be hilarious if we gave women the vote? Or, you know, what if we emancipated the slaves? What a society it might be like. And then 100 years later, 150 years later, civil wars, the suffragists are starving themselves to death, anarchists are bombing, you know, crowds of demonstrators and or actually rulers, killing rulers, assassinating rulers. And so the rubber meets the road at a certain point. The ideas that we develop in these intellectual contexts eventually manifest into mass politics. And my argument with Roe v. Wade is that this is the first time in which a group of, in this case, conservative Christians, Catholics, and Protestants said, no, we believe in a particular concept of personhood that we're going to mobilize around. We're going to vote on the basis of it. We're actually going to kill people on the basis of it in some cases. Now, in bioethics, we also thought that the issue of brain death had been solved. I'm not saying that Terri Schiavo was about brain death. It was kind of a complicated issue. But I think what Terri Schiavo revealed to us in bioethics was that while we had thought that brain death, the idea that personhood, you lost your personhood when your brain was irrecoverable, we thought that that had been pretty much a settled issue around 1980 when those laws got changed, that most of the country really wasn't there yet. And that if you go out to people and you say, look, do you think that you should be able to pull the plug on folks or just declare them dead just because their brain's dead, not everybody's with us on that. So there is a growing, what I argued in Citizen Cyborg was that there's a growing crystallization of issues which allow people to then begin to connect. It's certainly happening on the right, connect issues of fetal personhood to issues of the personhood of people at the end of life, and then to also make this argument that human life is special in comparison to animals. I called it in the book human racism, the idea that the human race is more important than anything else and that all you have to do to have moral standing is to be a human. And I talked in that book about all the different kinds of technologies which were going to be challenging these boundaries of humanness, which you heard also from Linda. So issues around currently apes and cetaceans, in the future animal-human chimeras, the perinatal complications that we're going to face when we have fully totipotent cells that we can then turn into human beings through gestation. The idea that we might be able to really complicate brain death by doing full brain repair with stem cells and other kinds of technologies, potentially brain prostheses, so someone who would have been declared dead under a brain death standard could be repaired. And so forth, to the future of artificial intelligence and other things we can't even imagine. On the right, folks are already looking at these technologies that are coming down the pike and saying, we are opposed to abortion, we think that this is a culture of death, we think that all you Enlightenment liberals are trying to screw around with human exceptionalism and the idea that we're ensouled beings, And they're saying that they're connecting the dots to these future technologies and saying, and for instance, in this manifesto on biotechnology and human dignity that was signed 10 years ago by all the leaders of the Christian right, that the uniqueness of human nature is at stake, human dignity is indivisible, every human being is possessed of an equal dignity of life at every stage of life, and a statement of human exceptionalism. But you also see it, as Steve pointed out, in the liberal discourses of rights. So this is the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights, came out 15 years ago. The human genome underlies the fundamental unity of all members of the human family, as well as the recognition of their inherent dignity and diversity. And I have this image here because when I talk to students about this, I say, what the hell is the human genome? You know, we share almost all of it with other animals, just a tiny fraction we don't share with other animals. And one of the things that we lost when we stopped being certain kinds of apes is this hair on our face. Here's a guy with hair on his face. Is he less of the human? You know, are conjoined twins human? Or are those folks that we found in Spain or Portugal or wherever who walk on all four limbs, are they human? The human genome is just as pointless an empirical fact to try to base rights on as anything else. So again, I think the point of this conference, the point of the Human Non-Human Rights Project is to make this point that conscious beings who can have moral standing as persons don't have to be human, and then not all humans are conscious beings with that kind of moral standing. So just pointing forward, I think the big challenges that we face with this particular struggle to instantiate moral standing on the basis of personhood, which is, I think, has long historical roots, a long set of kind of inertia behind it that, as George said, will lead us eventually to victory, but there are a lot of challenges on the way, as we've heard during this conference. There are challenges because partly the movements in which this is being acted through have already been riven, as we've heard already in this conference, by this particular claim of a consciousness-based ethics. The deep ecology folks would reject this particular argument. Karen has a problem with it because she thinks it leaves certain kinds of categories out of who need moral standing of a higher order than a personhood-based ethic would give them. And so animal rights is not going to be univocal on this particular personhood issue. There are huge problems, as Peter kind of gestured to, and if you know anything about his history, it's pretty clear that this is going to be a huge problem in the future, trying to argue that there should be one standard of neurological capacity that is the basis for all kind of moral standing will challenge what we do with infants, human infants, or it will really radically do what we do with animals, because if you wanted to treat every every animal that had the same capacity as a human infant as if it had the rights of a human infant, that would have much more radical consequences than we've been talking about at this conference. On the other hand, very few of us are willing, and including myself, to say that we can start eating infants or hunting infants or something like that. So this particular idea of complete moral equivalence on the basis of neurological standing is, I think, incredibly problematic. And at the other end, there's been a growing debate in bioethics, which I don't expect you to take seriously yet, but is interesting from our futurist point of view, about what post-persons might be like. What it might be like if you're saying that personhood or these capacities for consciousness should be the ground of moral standing, what will happen if we eventually create beings that have more of all those things, more rationality, more capacity for empathy, more capacity for forward thinking? Or would they be more important than existing human beings? Is it possible to tier personhood to say, well, all it is a threshold. Once you get past this threshold, you have all the rights, and nobody who ever has, you know, like 100 Gandhis rolled into one, they don't have any more rights than anybody else. That's certainly what I argued in Citizen Cyborg, but there are people who are saying that that's intellectually incoherent. So that's where this conference kind of came from for George and I, was this set of issues that we were debating. And I really thank you for the opportunity to illuminate me and educate me about these topics over the week. And I want to thank all of our folks sitting through David. I want to thank you for that, with relative calm. I think in the future we will maintained the IET persons list, which you have all been put onto. You can also get off of it, of course, if you don't want to be on it. But we'll be continuing to share news about personhood campaigns and personhood issues that we find in the news. And you're also welcome to use it for your own purposes to share the kinds of things that you heard about here. I want to thank my colleagues George, as I already have, Wendell from the Technology and Ethics Working Group and the Yale Bioethics Group. I want to thank Steve Latham and the Bioethics Group, Bruce Duncan and Tara Sem for their generous donations, and of course Arcus, who I already thanked. Chris for his yeoman work during the conference, and again, all of you, and I hope you have safe travels back home. Thank you very much.